At 8:30 on the morning of the 10th of November, 1944, Lieutenant Lester Wallace climbed down into a boat alongside his ship with 13 enlisted men and pushed off for the beach. Behind him, landing craft were tied up along the ship's side, and aerial depth charges were swinging up out of them and down into her holds. He had watched that same work every day for 7 weeks. He turned toward the beach and thought nothing of it. He was 29 years old, a taxman from Arlington, Virginia, in civilian life and the communications officer of the ship at his back. He was going ashore to sign for a stack of signal publications. The men with him had errands smaller still. 2 of them had appointments with a dentist. The mail clerks were going for the mail. 4 more of the crew had crossed earlier on the same sort of errand, in another boat. 25 minutes later, a sailor standing beside him on the sand screamed one word. "Look!" Out in the anchorage there was a flash, and then, for a moment, nothing happened at all. They were 2.5 miles away, which light crosses at once and sound does not. For about 12 seconds the harbour stayed silent. Then the blast came across the water and put every one of them on the ground. They got up and ran for the boat. It took the coxswain more than a quarter of an hour at full throttle to get back out to berth. 3-8? Oh, where the ship had been. There was no ship. There were no bodies. There was floating wreckage and an oil slick over an empty patch of harbour where 14,000 tons of steel had been riding at anchor half an hour earlier. Every man still aboard was gone. Not missing in the way men are usually missing at sea, not adrift somewhere in a raft waiting to be found. Gone in the way that leaves nothing to bury. When divers went down to survey the wreck, the largest piece of the ship they could find on the harbour floor measured 16 feet by 10. So, the United States Navy had a problem, and it was not the problem you would expect. It was not who did this. Half that harbour would have told you an enemy had done it, and 2 men would swear to it under oath, in detail, one of them with the markings on the aircraft. It was not even, at first, what did this. It was simpler and worse than either. Somebody now had to write down who had been on board. Every name. And the only complete record of who had been on board that ship had been on board that ship. For the next month, the United States Navy could not tell you how many of its own men it had just lost. It sent one number to Washington. Then it had to send a letter to take that number back. So here is the question. This whole story turns on, and it is not the one the newsreels would have asked. How do you count the dead of a ship that took its own list with it? Seeadler Harbour on Manus in the Admiralty Islands was not a place most Americans could have found on a map, and that was rather the point of it. It is a wide, deep, sheltered anchorage north of New Guinea, 15 miles long and 4 across, with enough water in it to take capital ships. The army had cleared the Japanese off Manus in March 1944, and within days the Seabees were ashore building a base. By the autumn, there were more than 600 moorings marked out in the harbour itself. On the morning of Friday, the 10th of November, there were something like 200 ships in that water. Escort carriers, destroyers, destroyer escorts, repair ships, oilers, tugs, minesweepers, landing ships, civilian crewed freighters. The fleets that were about to go into Luzon were being fed there, and the fighting on Leyte was 3 weeks old and still going. An anchorage like that runs on one thing above all others, and it is not courage. It is ammunition. A battleship that has emptied her magazines is a very expensive piece of scenery. Somebody has to bring the shells forward, 4,000 miles from the factories, and hand them across, ship to ship, at anchor, in the heat, day after day after day. That was what Mount Hood was for. She was a fleet ammunition ship, and at Manus she was not really behaving like a ship at all. She was behaving like a warehouse. The Navy's own account of it afterwards is exact and worth hearing. She was acting as an ammunition depot, both receiving and delivering ammunition to other ships and lighters simultaneously, with men working in all 5 of her holds. She gave ammunition out to warships going forward, and she took unused ammunition back in from ships going home, and quite often she did both at once. Hold on to that, because it is the reason for the part nobody could sort out afterwards. A ship like that is never only her own crew. On any given morning, there were working parties aboard from the amphibious boat pool, boat crews from other ships, Men who had come across with a lighter and stayed to help shift what they had brought. They came aboard, they worked to hold, they went away again. Nobody stood at the top of the gangway writing down the name of every man who set foot on that deck, because in a forward anchorage in the middle of a war, nobody has ever done that. Her own people were counted in a book. Everyone else was simply there. On the morning of the 10th, she was ringed by 9 landing craft. 350 yards off her port side lay the repair ship Mindanao, with men working on her open deck. 1,100 yards away lay Argonne, flagship of the service force. Around them, out to 2,000 yards and beyond, the rest of that fleet, and in among all of it the small boats going back and forth, back and forth. In her holds, by the Navy's own estimate, were 3,800 tons of ammunition. It was not one thing. Machine gun ammunition and shells for battleships and everything in between. Bombs stowed below and heavier bombs in a shack on the main deck. Rocket bodies and rocket motors. Smokeless powder, nose fuses, and aerial depth bombs filled with Torpex, which is what the Allies used when TNT was not violent enough for the job at hand. Nobody in that harbour thought any of this was strange. That is the part to hold on to. Every man who looked at Mount Hood swinging at her anchor that morning saw an ordinary, necessary, faintly tedious ship doing an ordinary, necessary, faintly tedious job. She was almost brand new, and she had not started life with that name. The hull was laid down in September of 1943 at Wilmington, North Carolina, as a merchant freighter under a maritime commission contract. The name on the paperwork was Marco Polo, a standard cargo hull, one of hundreds meant to carry crates. She was renamed Mount Hood on the 10th of November, 1943. Hold that date, we will come back for it at the end, and it will be worth something. She was launched 3 weeks later, taken over by the Navy in January, and sent to Norfolk to be turned into something else. An ammunition ship is not simply a freighter with dangerous cargo in it. She's supposed to be fitted out to carry the thing that can kill her. She was commissioned on the 1st of July 1944, under Commander Harold A. Turner, with a complement on paper of 318 officers and men. Getting the men was harder than getting the ship. Turner had trouble finding qualified seamen, and a great many of those he was sent were raw recruits who had never been to sea in their lives. We can be exact about this, because the Navy kept the arithmetic. Her people were carried on a printed form, filed by every ship in the fleet, and the last one filed for Mount Hood opens with 2 numbers. 260 enlisted men brought forward from the previous quarter. 36 more received on board since. 36. More than 1 man in 8 aboard her that morning had joined the ship within the previous few weeks, out at a forward base, on her first voyage. Remember that. It is going to matter when somebody has to work out who was standing on that deck. She loaded her holds at Norfolk and sailed on the 21st of August for the Panama Canal, crossed to the Pacific, went on alone by way of Finchhafen in New Guinea, and dropped anchor in Seeadler Harbour on the 22nd of September. Then she began issuing ammunition for the invasion of the Philippines. That is the whole of her career. 7 weeks of work in a forward anchorage, on her first voyage with a crew largely new to the sea and a captain who had had her for 4 months. There is a temptation in a story like this one to go looking for the flaw in the ship, and it is worth resisting, because the board that investigated her resisted it too, and what they found instead is a good deal less comfortable than a bad weld. Nothing was wrong with Mount Hood that anyone had noticed. She had never had an explosion. She had never had a fire. She had never had a scare of any kind. Wallace said so afterwards, and he was the only officer left alive to say anything about her at all. Nothing ever went wrong on that ship, right up to the morning when everything did. The investigation would eventually put its finger on one item out of those 3,800 tons, so it is worth knowing what it was, and why a man could watch it being loaded and feel nothing at all. An aerial depth bomb is a plain object, a steel cylinder with a rounded nose and a tail, small enough for one man to get his arms most of the way round, heavy enough that no man moves one alone, An aircraft carried it out over the sea and dropped it on a submarine, and a pistol set it off at a chosen depth. There is nothing clever about the outside of it. It looks like a piece of plumbing. What was inside it was newer than the war. Torpex is a British invention, developed at the Royal Gunpowder Factory at Waltham Abbey. The name is short for torpedo explosive, and it came into service in late 1942. It is a mixture, roughly 42% RDX, 40% TNT, and 18% powdered aluminium. By weight, it is about half again as powerful as TNT. The aluminium is the interesting part, and the reason the stuff exists. Aluminium burns late. In a detonation, it goes on reacting after the initial shock has passed, which stretches the pressure pulse out in time. On land, that is of limited use. Underwater, where the killing is done by pressure rather than by fragments, a longer pulse is worth a great deal. It is the difference between rattling a submarine and opening her up. So the Allies put Torpex into the things that had to work underwater first. Torpedoes, mines, depth charges. Then into bombs, including the heaviest anybody built. The mine Barnes Wallace bounced across a German reservoir was filled with it. And so were Tallboy and Grand Slam, the earthquake bombs. Which means the item that would come under suspicion was not some tired leftover from another war. It was one of the most modern and most carefully engineered explosives the Allies possessed, and Mount Hood was carrying it because the fleet outside her was hunting submarines and needed it. And here is the ordinary, unglamorous fact the whole thing turns on. Explosives of that class are stable. That is the entire point of them. A well-made depth bomb will sit in a hold in the tropics for months and do nothing, and will survive handling that looks alarming to anybody watching. Will survive, usually, given that the fuses and boosters are where they belong, that the casing is sound, that the item has not been sitting somewhere corroding, and that nobody has stacked the wrong things next to it. Take those conditions away, one at a time, and the margin narrows, quietly, without anything visible happening. Nothing announces it. The hold looks the same. The work looks the same. A bomb that has become dangerous looks precisely like a bomb that has not. That is why Wallace could glance over his shoulder at depth charges coming aboard on a bright morning in a calm harbour and see nothing worth a second thought. He was right about what he was looking at. Those were routine stores going into a routine ship. He could not see the other half of the sum, and neither could anyone else on deck. What was already down there, how it was stacked, what condition it had arrived in, and how hard the last few hundred loads had come down. Nobody was keeping a written record of that. As it turned out, nobody was keeping a reliable written record of who was carrying it either. There is one decision in this story that was made weeks before the explosion, by somebody whose name is not attached to it, and it did more damage than any single act aboard. Seeadler Harbour had 4 anchorages set aside specifically for ammunition ships. They were in the western part of the harbour, away from the crowd. That is what they were for. If the worst happens aboard a ship full of high explosive, the only thing that limits the disaster is distance, and the Navy knew that perfectly well, which is why the berths existed and why they were where they were. Those berths were not used. Her allocated position, according to published accounts of the board's findings, was shifted twice before she was settled at berth 380. In the calm water near the centre of the harbour, 4 miles from the entrance and 2.5 miles from land in about 120 feet of water. The berth number itself we can confirm because the ship moored next to her wrote it down. The reason was convenience. Berth 380 was a shorter run for the landing craft and the lighters that had to carry ammunition back and forth all day. It made the work go faster. So, on the 10th of November, the single largest concentration of high explosive in the Admiralty Islands was sitting in the middle of 200 ships, with 9 loaded landing craft tied to her sides, because it saved the small boats a trip out to the western anchorages. Now look at who was moored next door. Berth 381 was the repair ship Mindanao, 350 yards away. She was a floating workshop, one of the ships that kept a forward base running, and her own war diary for that month lists the work her people did in the first 9 days of November. Vessel after vessel brought alongside or worked on where she lay. USS Mount Hood is on that list. For the 9 days before the 10th of November, the ammunition ship was Mindanao's customer. Her men had been aboard her or her equipment had been in their shops, right up to the week that ended in the explosion. When Mount Hood went up, she killed the people who had been repairing her, and she killed them at a range of 350 yards, which is to say from close enough to shout across. No one who assigned that berth could have told you it was going to kill anybody. Every decision in it looked reasonable at the time. That is generally how these things are assembled. At 08:55, a flash and a column of flame and smoke came up out of her amidships, higher than her own masts. That was the first explosion, and by the standard of what came next, it was small. The men who happened to be looking at her described it as the sort of blast a single bomb makes. It lasted a few seconds. Then the rest of the cargo went. 3,800 tons of ordnance detonated more or less together. The smoke column went up 7,000 feet. For 500 yards in every direction, nothing could be seen at all. The ship, the water around her and the landing craft alongside simply went into a black wall. Steel fragments and live projectiles were flung outward for more than 2,000 yards, which is to say, more than a mile. Within 500 feet of where she had floated, there was, in the Navy's own words, nothing left. The 9 landing craft moored alongside ceased to exist with her, along with a pontoon lighter and 13 smaller boats. 10 ships within 2,500 feet were badly damaged, and 26 more out to 6,500 feet were hit as well. Aboard the Australian frigate Hawkesbury, 2 signalmen standing the visual watch saw the first flash and were still sounding the alarm bells when the main blast rolled the ship under them. She put her motor cutter in the water and sent it toward the smoke, and so did a great many other ships, until there was an improvised fleet of small boats converging on the middle of that anchorage, looking for men to pull out of the water. On the port radio frequency, the calls went out for everything a base can send: boats, doctors, stretchers, blood, and clergymen for the dead and the dying. They found debris. Mindanao, 350 yards off, took it broadside. Flying steel opened her portside, and the men working there were killed where they stood. Her own war diary, written up that month by somebody who had been standing on her when it happened, describes what became of the ship next door in one sentence. And it is the flattest sentence in this entire story. At approximately 0850, the USS Mount Hood, anchored in berth 380, disintegrated from internal explosion, apparently ammunition. Note the time. The base commander's report says 0855. The ship 350 yards away wrote 0850. Both are originals, written within days, by people who were there, and they do not agree to the minute. That is what real records look like, and it is worth knowing before anybody quotes you a timeline to the second. The same war diary has one more phrase that stops you. It says the dead, the wounded, and the shocked were transferred to the base hospital and to other ships in the harbour. The shocked. It was a category. Somebody had to move them too. Now the numbers, and they need care, because this is where nearly every account of this disaster goes wrong. The commander of the naval base at Manus sent Washington a table, ship by ship, of what the explosion had cost. Across the whole fleet, 45 known dead, 327 missing, 371 injured. Repairs to the damaged ships were estimated at 107,000 man-hours. Against Mindanao's name in that table stand 23 dead and 174 injured, and an estimate of 48,000 man-hours to put her back together. You will also find it written, in good places, that Mindanao lost more than 80 men. The Naval History and Heritage Command says over 80 in one publication and 23 in another. That is the United States Navy disagreeing with itself about the same ship. We are going with 23, and here is the reasoning, because you should not have to take our word for it. If 82 men had died on Mindanao alone, then 45 known dead across the entire fleet. in a table drawn up ship by ship and sent to the commander-in-chief 3 weeks later, would be impossible. Her missing column in that table is empty. Her dead are counted as dead. The higher number cannot be fitted into the document without breaking it. We are taking the paper the Navy filed at the time and telling you plainly that its own historians have since printed something else. Add it up as the base did, and the cost of one ship exploding at anchor with no enemy within hundreds of miles was 743 men killed, missing or injured on a quiet Friday morning. Of the 327 missing, 295 were Mount Hood's own. Now look at how the same table accounts for some of the others, because it is the same problem in miniature. Against the entry for 7 landing craft belonging to Boat Pool 15, the missing column reads 19. Against a landing craft attached to the repair ship Sierra 4. Against a landing ship attached to Briareus 3. 26 men entered against boats, not against a ship's company. Against the craft they had arrived in. Those men were not Mount Hood's crew. They were the working parties, the coxswains and hands who spent their war carrying other people's ammunition out of other people's holds and who had been alongside her that morning doing exactly that. There was no book at that anchorage with their names in it, because they did not belong to the ship they died on. They belonged to a boat pool, and the boats had gone too. One of them lived, and only because somebody changed his orders. Seaman First Class Lawrence Gashler should have been in Mount Hood's holds with the rest of his boat pool crew, unloading. Instead, he had been told off to run an officer from the escort carrier Omine Bay across the harbour. He is quoted afterwards, and this comes from the transcript of the investigation rather than from the Navy's summary, so take it as such. In his mind, he said, they had just passed the hood when it blew up. There was a bright flash and he could feel the heat. Then a second later the concussion hit, knocked the officer down and knocked him out. When he came to, debris was falling in the water around him. He is not on Mount Hood's report of changes. He would not have been on it if he had died. And then, 5 weeks later, comes the small, bleak document that tells you how solid that number really was. On the 14th of December, the commander of the naval base at Manus wrote to Washington to correct his own war diary. Personnel missing from USS Mount Hood, he wrote, is 295 and not 331. Total number of personnel missing is 327 and not 363. 36 men moved off one list and onto another with a stroke of a pen, more than a month after they died. They were not correcting an opinion. They were correcting the count of their own dead, because at first they had not been able to say who was on the ship. Within days, the Navy convened a board of investigation, a captain and 2 commanders. They set up aboard the destroyer tender Sierra, and they began doing what such boards do. They called witnesses. They called a great many witnesses, because witnesses were the only material they had. Consider what a board like that normally works from. It works from the ship, over the wreck compartment by compartment, reading the damage backwards to find the seat of the explosion. It reads the deck log, the loading records, and the stowage plans, and knows exactly what was in which hold and who put it there. It interviews the surviving crew, especially anyone who was near the blast. The board had none of that. The crew who had been aboard were dead, all of them, without exception. The paperwork had been aboard, so the paperwork was dead too. And the wreck was not a wreck. That last point deserves a moment, because it is the strangest thing in the whole record. When the divers went down into Seeadler Harbour to survey the remains of a 460-foot ship, they found essentially nothing. A few stray pieces of plating. The largest fragment on the bottom measured 16 feet by 10. What they found instead was a trench. The explosion had dug a trough into the floor of the harbour, directly beneath where she had been lying. More than 100 yards long, 50 feet wide, 30 to 40 feet deep. Longer than a football field, cut into the seabed in a fraction of a second. That trench was the largest single piece of physical evidence the United States Navy possessed concerning the loss of USS Mount Hood, and it was not a piece of the ship at all. It was a hole the ship had pushed into the world on her way out of it. No human remains were recovered, not one man. So the board interviewed. 133 witnesses gave testimony, supported by dozens of exhibits, most of them photographs. It took a month to gather. Lieutenant Wallace was called twice, which is no surprise since he was the only surviving officer of the ship and had been looking at her from a boat 25 minutes before she died. One source note before the investigation, because most retellings of this story will not give you one. The board's own record, the transcript of those 133 witnesses, is not digitized anywhere we could reach it. It is paper, in the archives, and we have not held it in our hands. What we have held is the Navy's own confidential summary of the case, written by the Chief of Naval Operations Staff, which carries the findings almost line for line, and that is where every finding you are about to hear comes from. Where something comes instead from the transcript, by way of historians who did work from it, we will say so as we go. That distinction matters here more than usual, because of what happened when the board started taking statements. When there is nothing to see, men see what they expect. An aviation ordnance man named Edward Ponichtera, working on the beach, testified that he had watched a twin-engined Japanese bomber fly over and put 2 bombs into Mount Hood, both of them direct hits. He offered a detail to settle the matter. He had clearly observed the rising sun painted on the plane. A sailor named Carl Hughes, aboard a Liberty ship in the harbor, testified that he had seen a Japanese midget submarine break the surface near Mount Hood and fire 2 torpedoes into her. Neither thing happened. There was no air raid on Seeadler Harbour that morning. A base packed with warships, radar and lookouts would have had a great deal to say about it. There was no midget submarine. Those men were not liars, and it is important not to sneer at them. They had been standing in an ordinary morning when the world detonated, and the mind goes looking for a cause the size of the effect. In November 1944, in that ocean, a thing that size was Japanese. So they saw a rising sun. Hold that thought, because the same instinct is about to turn up somewhere much quieter. When a man cannot see the answer, he reaches for the one that fits the size of the hole. The board had to sort real evidence out of that, with no wreck, no records, and no bodies to check any of it against. They could not tell you what set it off. They said so plainly, and that honesty is the most valuable thing in the file. The finding was that the explosion was caused by a force or agency within the ship itself. No enemy. Nothing from outside. Whatever killed her, she had been carrying it, and she had been carrying it for a while. Beyond that, they gave a probability, and they hedged it. The most probable cause was rough handling of ammunition while loading or unloading, and the spread of the explosion had been made worse by inadequate separation of incompatible items in stowage. They had one specific suspicion, and it is the reason this story began where it did. The evidence pointed to the possible detonation of Torpex-loaded depth bombs while they were being loaded into number 3 or number 4 hold. That detonation could have been caused, the analysis said, by striking the hatch with the bombs on the way down, or by dropping them into the hold carelessly. Aerial depth charges being swung aboard out of the landing craft alongside. That is what Lester Wallace saw over his shoulder as his boat pulled away and thought nothing of, because he had watched it every day for 7 weeks. That is as close to an answer as exists. A bomb knocked against a hatch combing. A load let go a foot too early. Something in that family, done by men who were dead before they could know what they had done, in a hold no one ever saw again. But if the investigation could not prove the trigger, it could prove the conditions. And here the record stops being a mystery and starts being an indictment. It established that ammunition was being roughly handled in all parts of the ship. Not in one hold. All of them. It established that boosters, fuse, and detonators were stowed together in a single hold, in a manner directly contrary to the regulations governing the transport of military explosives. Those are precisely the items you keep apart so that one accident cannot become every accident. It established that broken rockets, with powder spilled out of them, had been stowed in 2 of the holds. It established that the safety regulations for handling ammunition were not posted anywhere conspicuous aboard. and that there was a general lack of instruction of the crew in safety measures. On a ship crewed substantially by men who had never been to sea. It established that pyrotechnics and napalm incendiaries were being kept in a temporary hut of wood and tar paper on the open deck, beside the hatch of number 4 hold. It established that ammunition had been accepted aboard that was definitely defective and should have been destroyed or dumped in deep water instead. It established that the fire hoses were not laid out, and that fire drills were held infrequently. And it established that the prohibition on smoking in the boats lying alongside an ammunition ship was not being enforced. 8 findings. Not one of them exotic. Every one of them the kind of thing that gets caught and corrected on a ship where somebody senior is making sure it gets caught and corrected. 2 further things are reported from the transcript rather than the summary, and I flag them as such, because we could not put our own eyes on either. The first is a finding. An overall lack of experience in the crew, and a lack of leadership among the 22 officers, reflected in the rough handling of ammunition. The second is a sentence of Wallace's. He had signed for a good deal of what was in those holds, and he is quoted as telling the board that there was quite a bit of damaged ammunition aboard, that some of it was corroded, and that he himself remembered seeing pyrotechnics with dates on them going back as far as 1915. 1915. If that is right, then flares manufactured, while the previous World War was still being fought, were sitting in the holds of a floating magazine in 1944, because nobody wanted to be the man who threw away government property. Had Commander Harold Turner survived, he and his senior officers would have been held responsible. He did not survive. Nobody aboard did. A verdict was delivered against men already past the reach of it, and there is no satisfaction in that for anyone. It is worth being careful here, and the Navy was careful, so we will be. Probable is not proven. The investigation named a likely mechanism and a set of conditions that could turn a small accident into an enormous one. It never claimed to know what actually happened in number 3 or number 4 hold at 5 minutes to 9, and it did not pretend otherwise. The last man to see the ship alive put it better than the paperwork did. Wallace, asked about it afterwards, said, "I guess no one ever will know what really happened. She just blew. We had never had an explosion of any kind on the Mount Hood before that." The board issued its findings on the 14th of December, 1944. Mount Hood had been struck from the Naval Register 3 days earlier. And on that same 14th of December, in another office, somebody was still trying to answer the first question. Every ship in the United States Navy filed a report of changes. It is the least dramatic document in naval life. A printed form, filed monthly, recording what happened to a ship's enlisted men. Who joined, who left, who was promoted, disrated, discharged, sentenced, transferred. Names down the left, alphabetically, surname first and the first name written in full, then the service number, the rating, the date and place of enlistment. Then a second set of columns for what changed and when. Ordinarily, it is the dullest paper on the ship. Mount Hood's last one runs to 20 pages, and it was filled in after she no longer existed. We have read it. It is held by the National Archives in the personnel records of the Bureau of Naval Personnel, and it has been scanned, and anybody who wants to can go and look at the same pages we looked at. Column 1 is the names, page after page of them, in the alphabetical order that pays no attention to rank or job or how long a man had been aboard. Column 7 is headed Received, Transferred, Deserted, Discharged, Change of Rating, Death, or any other change of status. It is a wide column, because a great many things can happen to a man. For most of 20 pages it contains one word: killed. Column 8 is the date, the same date over and over until the eye stops seeing it. 11/10/44. Column 9 is the widest of all. Its heading asks for the vessel or station to which a man was transferred, where he was discharged and the character of the discharge, where he deserted and the amount due or overpaid, where he died, the cause of death, and where and when he was buried, where he died, the cause of death, and where and when he was buried. The answer, written once and then repeated with ditto marks down the whole page, is 5 words long. explosion of USS Mount Hood. And then, scattered through those 20 pages, a handful of lines look different. Column 7 on those lines does not say killed. It says transferred. Column 9 gives a destination, a receiving station ashore. Navy number 3205, which is the base at Manus. Those are the men who were not aboard. You can find them if you are willing to go line by line, and you have to be careful, because the top half of each sheet and the bottom half are numbered separately, and a single line slip moves a man from the dead to the living. On our first pass through that film, we had one of these men on the wrong side of it. Robert Carl Tompkins, Quartermaster First Class of Detroit, is line 4 on page 19, and he was killed. Line 5 is Archie Trader, Fireman First Class of Philadelphia, and he was transferred ashore, one line apart. Here are the men we could confirm, by name, from the ship's own last form. In most published accounts of this disaster, they appear only as a number. Warren Bolter, Fire Controlman of Los Angeles. Grover Klingman, Sonarman of Cincinnati. Daniel DeLena of New York. Cornelius Donato of Providence. Cornelius Driscoll of Boston. Walter Edwards, motor machinist's mate of Lowell, Massachusetts. Victor Fabro of Newark. Robert Flanders of Manchester, New Hampshire. Anthony Futia of New York. James Howe, fireman of Pittsburgh. Nicholas Katsanis of Newark. Milton May, fireman of Detroit. Joseph Ranieri of Newark. Roy Terry of Lafayette, Louisiana. Archie Trader of Philadelphia. And Edward Zipowitz, storekeeper of New York, who is the last name on the last page, one line below 9 men who were killed. A note on how exact this paper is, and is not. The officer who signed it wrote his own middle initial as H. The Navy's press release about him, 3 months later, made it A. Even his name is on the record 2 ways, 16 names. The form's own summary says 17 men were transferred that month. We have found 16 of them, and we will not invent the 17th. So if you go looking through those pages yourself and you find him, tell us and we will say so. And at the end of the form is a single sheet that does the arithmetic. And it is the reason we went looking in the first place. It is called a recapitulation sheet, and it has a printed line at the top reading for the quarter ending. Then a date. On this one, the printed date has been struck out in ink and a new one written above it. 10 November. The quarter did not end, the ship did. Below it, the ledger. Brought forward from last quarter, 260. Received on board, 36. Total on board during the quarter, 296. Then the long printed list of everything that can remove a man from a ship's books. Honorable discharge, medical survey, bad conduct, desertion, retirement. Turned over to civil authorities. Line after line, blank. Transfers to other ships or stations. 17. Then a printed line that says simply, died. And beside it, in ink, in a clerk's hand, somebody has written the word that actually applied. Killed, 279. Total loss, 296. And then the last line on the form, the one every ship's writer in the United States Navy filled in every quarter without thinking about it. The line that exists so that the Bureau in Washington can carry the balance forward to next time. Remaining on board and carried forward. 0. That is the answer to the question this story started with. 296 enlisted men on the books. 17 ashore, 279 killed. The form tracks enlisted men only, so her 22 officers are counted somewhere else, and of those, one was in a boat. It balances. It took 5 weeks and it had to be rebuilt ashore out of the duplicates that had never been aboard. But somebody got there in the end. And there is one more thing in that arithmetic, and it is uncomfortable. Add the officers to the enlisted men, and Mount Hood lost 300 people. The base's casualty table, the document from which very nearly every published account of this disaster descends, credits her with 296. 296 is also exactly the number of enlisted men she had on her books. That may be a coincidence. It is more likely that somebody who could not count the dead wrote down the size of the crew. The last page carries a signature. It is not a stamp, it is a man's handwriting, and beneath it the typed line gives his name, his rank, and the office he was holding on the day he signed. Lieutenant, United States Naval Reserve, Senior Surviving Officer. Lester Wallace had gone ashore on the 10th of November to sign for a stack of publications. He came back to a ship that was not there, and the last thing he did for her was sign the paperwork. 9 months later, on the 15th of August 1945, the Chief of Naval Operations issued a confidential circular. It went out to every ship and every station in the United States Navy. Its subject was an explosion aboard an ammunition vessel in the Pacific Theater of Operations. Its purpose was to describe what had happened and to set out the unsafe practices that had existed aboard so that it would not happen to anybody else. Read it now, and you will recognize every line. 3,800 tons. 5 holds worked at once. Rough handling throughout the ship. Boosters and fuses and detonators stowed together. Broken rockets. The wood and tar paper hut on deck. The defective ammunition accepted aboard. The hoses not laid out. The smoking in the boats alongside. The Torpex depth bombs going down into number 3 or number 4 hold. Every fact of her death circulated to the whole fleet as a lesson. And nowhere in that document is she called Mount Hood. She is an ammunition vessel. The name is not in the subject line, not in the summary, not in the findings, not anywhere. There is a reason of a sort. The circular was confidential, and the Navy in 1945 routinely stripped identifying detail out of safety material. The point of the document was the practice, not the ship. It was not a conspiracy, and we are not going to dress it up as one. But look at the date on it again. The 15th of August, 1945. 9 months after she blew up, and 3 days after the war it was written for had effectively ended. The Navy's own historians put it plainly. The violations found aboard Mount Hood were not widely circulated until after another ammunition ship blew up off Guadalcanal in January 1945. The lesson was late. It went out anonymously, and it went out behind the next disaster. There is a credit side, and it belongs here. Mount Hood was not alone in that year. West Lock in May, Port Chicago in July, Mount Hood in November, the ship off Guadalcanal in January. Out of those came new rules for how the United States Navy loads and unloads munitions. What may be stowed beside what? How a thing may be lifted, and how far it may be allowed to fall, and who has to be standing there watching while it happens. Which berth an ammunition ship swings from, and how far that berth has to be from everybody else. Sailors have grumbled about those rules ever since, in the way sailors grumble about any procedure that makes a job take longer. Very few of them have ever been told where the rules came from. They came out of a trench in the floor of Seeadler Harbour, 100 yards long, with 279 enlisted men and 21 officers still in it. There is a date we left lying on the table earlier, and it is time to pick it up. The hull was laid down as a merchant freighter called Marco Polo. She was given the name of an American mountain, and the day they gave it to her was the 10th of November, 1943. She was USS Mount Hood for 1 year, to the day. 1 voyage, 7 weeks of work, and a grave that holds no wreck, no bodies, and in the document that mattered most, not even her name. So consider what the 2 pieces of paper did. The important one, the circular that carried the whole meaning of 300 deaths to the entire United States Navy and changed how ammunition is handled to this day, took her name out. The ordinary one, a monthly bookkeeping form no admiral would ever read, kept every name she had. 279 of them under the word killed. 17 under the word trans. A balance line at the bottom reading 0, signed by the only officer left to sign it. That is the part that stays with you about Lester Wallace's mourning. He did not live because he was brave or quick or lucky in any way he could have arranged for himself. He lived because somebody had to sign for a stack of signal publications. 2 of his men lived because their teeth needed looking at. The male clerks lived because the mail had come in. 18 men stepped off that ship for the most forgettable reasons available to a sailor, and 25 minutes later, the reason they were alive was that a dentist on Manus had appointments free. 300 stayed aboard and did their work properly in the middle of a harbour full of the United States fleet, on a day when nothing was supposed to happen at all. They have no graves, so say it because the document would not. USS Mount Hood, AE-11. Commander Harold Turner. 279 enlisted men and 21 officers on the bottom of Manus, and 45 more killed aboard the ships around her. Almost none of this came out of a history book. It came out of the Navy's own paper. The loss report the base commander sent to Washington, and his correction letter of the 14th of December. The war diary of the repair ship moored 350 yards away, which is where the berth number and the word disintegrated come from. The confidential analysis of August 1945, with the ship's name cut out of it. And 20 pages of a personnel form in the National Archives that nobody has had much reason to open. We read them. They are still there, and they are still worth reading. One more group belongs in this, and they are almost never mentioned. For a week afterwards, from the 11th to the 17th of November, the wreckage in that anchorage was cleared and the damaged ships patched up by construction battalions. The 46th, the 58th, and the 71st, the 585th and 610th maintenance units, and the 1050th and 1051st diving units. That is in Mindanao's war diary as well, in the same flat handwriting as everything else. Somebody had to go down into the water where the ship had been. If your father or your grandfather served with the Pacific Service Force in the ammunition ships or the repair ships or the boat pools at Manus, or with the Seabees who cleared Seeadler Harbour afterwards, or if the names Mindanao or Argonne or Hawkesbury mean something in your family, put it in the comments. The man's name and his ship or his unit. And if one of the 16 names we read out is a name from your family, we would very much like to hear it. Because as far as we can tell, they have not been printed anywhere until now. That is how a crew stays a crew instead of becoming a number in a column. The least the rest of us can do is know what they were doing when it happened. They were passing ammunition forward so that somebody else's guns would be full.